In the context of current nuclear threats and the Russo-Ukrainian war abroad, I cannot help but picture my mom in the 80s among the little girls in the Ukraine today. I resonate with the people of Ukraine because the force of unbridled control which they are resisting is similar to that which my parents resisted and remains as a painful, oppressive legacy in Cuba today. Today, on the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, I am honored to present our panel in discussion of the possibility of a current nuclear threat and how lessons from 60 years ago can inform the decisions President Biden will make today. Nina Khrushcheva, great-granddaughter of former Soviet Union Premier Nikita Khrushchev, is a professor in the Julian J. Studley Graduate Program of International Affairs at the New School in New York City. She is also an editor and contributor to Project Syndicate, Association of Newspapers Around the World. David Ignatius is a best-selling author and prize-winning foreign affairs columnist for the Washington Post, as well as an editor for the publication. Graham Allison is a Dillon Professor of Government at Harvard University's JFK School of Government, of which he is also founding dean. Allison has received the Defense Department's highest civilian award, the Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, for reshaping relations with Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan to reduce a former Soviet nuclear arsenal. Please join me in a round of applause as we welcome our panel. Thank you.
So Nina, why don't we put you in the middle? So thank you very much and good evening. As President Zelensky's Ukrainian forces advance and Putin's threats to conduct nuclear strikes against Ukraine grow louder, many are now hearing echoes of events 6 decades ago in the eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation between the individual for whom this school is named and the grandfather of one of the members of the panel who is the leader of the Soviet Union. Now, as President Biden said last week, quote, "For the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have a direct threat to use nuclear weapons if things continue down the current path," close quote. The question before the forum tonight is what lessons we can learn from the missile crisis to illuminate the challenge the U.S. and the West now face in Ukraine, and to inform the choices President Biden is considering. The game plan for the next 60 minutes is to begin with a brief reminder of these events that historians agree were the most dangerous moment in recorded history. How dangerous? Well, in a quiet aside during the middle of the missile crisis, RFK, Bobby Kennedy, asked his brother, and JFK said he thought the odds were somewhere between 1 and 3 and even that this ended in a nuclear war. And nothing that historians have found in the years since have lengthened those odds. So we're fortunate to have with us tonight, as the introducer already said, Nina Khrushcheva and David Ignatius to reflect on this event. Nina, David, and I'll each state succinctly what we think are some of the lessons that can be learned from the missile crisis that might help folks struggling with this issue today in Washington. And then following the discussion among us, we'll open it to the floor for suggestions and questions. So let me first get us going with the picture here briefly. So 60 years ago, October 17, 1962, what was happening? JFK and the small group of people that he called to help consult him about this dilemma were struggling with the question how to respond to the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba. 7 points briefly. First, 5 months before this, or 5 months after he was inaugurated president of the U.S., JFK met with the leader, Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, in Vienna. This was the height of the Cold War. Each was essentially taking the measure of his adversary. Jump to October 14, 1962, couple of days ago this year. A US U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and took pictures that photo intelligence analysts identified, where they identified nuclear-armed missiles, nuclear medium and intermediate range missiles being constructed on the island of Cuba. When operational, these missiles would be able to deliver nuclear weapons against every American military base and every major city like Washington and New York and Boston. 3, from the outset, JFK determined this could not stand. His initial reaction, his instinct, like that of every other member of the ExComm, was that we have to conduct an airstrike on these missiles now to prevent them ever being capable of attacking the US. So what he and his colleagues did not know, but which we as historians do now know because we've discovered it in the years since, that in addition to the medium and intermediate range missiles in Cuba, the 40,000 troops there who were both constructing and building the facilities had brought with them 100 tactical nuclear weapons. So had the US bombed the missiles and followed with the invasion that was planned, unknown to Kennedy, but he would have discovered that the American troops were incinerated by the Soviet tactical nuclear weapons. And from there to full-scale nuclear war would be a short step. 4, fortunately, Kennedy refused to make an immediate decision, instead insisting on time for deliberation. Over the course of a week, he and his key advisors changed their minds more than once. Eventually, they decided to impose a naval blockade, they call it a quarantine, on any additional shipments to Cuba. So let's see what he said. This was on October 22nd.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Okay. So, in the course of this, a week of quarantine, it became clear that the quarantine was not preventing the Soviets from completing the construction of the missiles already in Cuba, and that they were rapidly approaching the point at which they would be able to be launched against the US. So Kennedy's back was up against the wall. On the final Saturday, the 27th, he sort of figured that if he delayed much longer, Khrushchev's project would be completed, and the Soviets would have a strategic nuclear base 90 miles off the US shore. But if you attack the missiles, some of them might be launched against American cities. So Kennedy and Khrushchev established, in effect, a relationship over the course of these events as they thought about the difficult choices they were making. Khrushchev had a number of the very best lines during the crisis. This was in one private secret letter to Kennedy in which he says, we should think about this. We should not now keep pulling on the ends of a rope in which we've tied a knot, because the more the two of us pull, the tighter the knot will become. And will reach the point at which neither of us will be able to untie it. So both Kennedy and Khrushchev peered over the precipice. This is point 6. They saw nuclear Armageddon in their future, and both had sober second thoughts. In a sequence that reminds one vividly of Kurosawa's great classic film, Rashomon, JFK and Khrushchev both pulled back. In Moscow, Khrushchev essentially agreed to withdraw the missiles for a U.S. guarantee not to invade Cuba in the future. But at the same time, before he knew that Khrushchev had made that choice, Kennedy was preparing and even offered a much more complex deal, consisting of a magic cocktail, 3 elements. First, the public deal, exchange, pledge to not invade, withdrawal of the missiles. Secondly, a secret ultimatum that said to Khrushchev, you've got to resolve this within 48 hours or I will. And third, a super secret sweetener that said, if the missiles are withdrawn from Cuba, 6 months thereafter, the missiles you've been concerned about in Turkey will be withdrawn. So finally, there's lots more to read. There's a lot more to watch and experience, including an excellent exhibit at the JFK Library just here in Boston. But as we try to learn lessons for dealing with Putin today, I look forward to hearing comments from our colleagues Nina and David. So let's turn to Nina.
Well, thank you so much. Well, I'm a Ruski, so I have to always sort of explain the Russian side. Since Graham so well explained the American side, let me tell you a little bit what drove Khrushchev to bring rockets into Cuba. It's not that he was walking and think, well, let me just attack America. It was not. In fact, it was very clear, and unlike Putin, by the way, he always said these are very defensive weapons. So what happened was in '61, those weapons in Turkey, rockets, American rockets in Turkey, were installed, and he was in Bulgaria. Those of you who know geography a little bit, it's on the other side, the Black Sea. And he was shown Turkey, and his Minister of Defense said to him, by the way, these are all new American, relatively new American rockets that are faced, you said they're going to face Washington, New York, that are facing Moscow, Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, Kiev, and other Soviet cities. Khrushchev was a very passionate man, and he said, oh, okay, well, that's unfair. I'm really very much for parity. I don't want them to take out Fidel Castro because if you check the Guinness Book of Records, Fidel Castro had more assassination attempts than anybody ever in history. It's over 600. So this is our ally, so we're not going to allow them to do anything to Castro. What we're going to do, we are going to throw a hedgehog into Uncle Sam's pants. And that rockets into Cuba was that hedgehog into, do I pronounce it correctly? Hedgehog into US pants. So that's what Khrushchev's motivation, a lot of it was parity. Americans have it, we the Soviets are going to have it. One of the things that I want to mention about the lessons of history, I actually don't believe, and Graham and I just talked about this, history really doesn't teach any lessons. But it does punish very severely those who haven't learned from the lessons that history offered. In my view, Vladimir Putin learned 0 lessons from this. Khrushchev was a politician. I know we're in America, all Soviet leaders are alike, they're all dictators and whatnot, and they are quite despotic. But still, Khrushchev and Gorbachev were a bit different, so they were politicians, as inferior as Soviet politics may be. Putin is not a politician. He's a KGB deputy colonel who functions as a KGB deputy colonel. It's very important to mention that he's not even a colonel, he's a deputy colonel. So that really just, I mean, I don't even know whether there's a rank like that in the United States, but that's an important distinction. So as a deputy colonel, he doesn't make political decisions. And something that Graham so well put together is those changes in both Kennedy and Khrushchev approach. That's a political change. They actually do back and forth. They can figure out, they play on what the other side is. We are not seeing this too much with Putin. So he hasn't learned that much from that history. One of the things that I'm also not seeing today, and I may be wrong, because the rhetoric is very, very angry on all sides, is that both Kennedy and Khrushchev used a lot of back channels. And back channels were very important for resolving the conflict. All sorts of people were involved, from family members to informal advisors and so on. So that's very important. I don't know. I'm not seeing, if there is back channels today, I'm just not seeing much progress going on there. Insults go, but back channels, not seeing that. So that's, once again, lesson has not been learned. And the rhetoric, there was very, very aggressive rhetoric in 1962, but it wasn't personally aggressive rhetoric. It was a political rhetoric of presenting the other side as an enemy, and yet politically it was reasonably diplomatic, as diplomacy was then. 60 years later, diplomacy actually took a giant hit. And we see it from diplomats using completely non-diplomatic rhetoric, in fact, on all sides, which I think is important. One thing that Graham mentioned, the dates that are there, September 27th was that breaking point, was a complete breaking point, because the two U-2 reconnaissance planes were shot down. I think it was called the Black Saturday, right? Was it? Right. So the U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba by the Cubans, because the Soviets forgot to tell the Cubans, don't shoot anything, because we're already in a problem. And then U-2, the U-2, another U-2, by mistake, just very briefly got into the Soviet territory. And so that was a horrible disaster, because the Soviets could have shot back. And so that was the moment. And by the way, Fidel Castro at the time said to Khrushchev that, you know what, there's going to be American attack on Cuba, so you might as well use nuclear weapons now, because otherwise they're just going to shoot you out. Khrushchev completely freaked out, because there's 3 incidents that were something that he realized that even if you control things, you can't control things. The mistake is possible, and then it's going to be a disaster. Once again, a lesson that Putin has not learned, because there have been so many incredible possibilities for a disaster. We're still an inch away from any of them turning into something more horrible. So that's a lesson Putin hasn't learned, and Khrushchev did. And that's when Khrushchev, in fact, delivered his final message to Kennedy on the radio without warning anybody, just because he really wanted to take the global, kind of the global atmosphere and explain and say that they're done. They're done with it. He didn't want to waste any time.
So maybe just one more.
Yes, and just exactly one more. So I think Joe Biden, as you said correctly, I think he's doing reasonably. I mean, calling Putin a murderer may not be such a good thing, but when to all these potential threats of Putin on using the nuclear weapons, when he said, "I'm not bluffing," Biden responded that we're not afraid of it, and if we are going to use any weapons, it's going to be conventional. And I think Putin heard the message, because as you see in the last week, the rhetoric has toned down, and Putin is a horrible thing that are being done to Ukraine right now with the killing the infrastructure, but yet it is an important distinction still. So they're using the conventional weapons. And so one last thing that I want to say is that Khrushchev took a hit in his reputation, because he got what he wanted. And when he was ousted in 1964, his adversaries were saying, well, one of the horrible things you did, you took weapons out of Cuba, and you basically diminished our standing in the world. And he said, what? His response was, you wanted the Third World War? Of course I took the weapons out of Cuba. And by the way, our reputation increased and not diminished. He got what he wanted. Fidel Castro stayed on, died his own death. missiles got out of Turkey. And in fact, as you know, the relationship between Kennedy and Khrushchev increased and got much, much better. And if Kennedy didn't tragically die in '63, Khrushchev may not have been ousted in '64, and the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union may have flourished, and the Cold War could have been over, say, in 1965.
Oh, fascinating, fascinating. So, Nina and I have been talking about this before. As she's demonstrated, it's certainly possible to learn lessons from history. It's just that, unfortunately, most policymakers don't learn lessons from history, and then, as she says, are punished by history. So, good. David. David has also been writing about this earlier, as well as thinking about it over many decades. So, thank you, David.
Well, let me begin just with a personal recollection. 60 years ago, I was 12, and I have a distinct memory of my father, who was then Assistant Secretary of the Army, and who was, in fact, the civilian who was responsible for planning the logistics of the invasion of Cuba, moving the troops south, preparing for what would be their embarkation. On one of these dark days in late October, whether it was Black Saturday, I don't remember, I remember seeing my father look ashen. I couldn't remember anything I'd ever seen quite like that. And of course, he was in that moment not sure that he would ever see his children again. I mean, that's the way, as he later put it, he's still alive at 102. That's the way it felt. So it's important to remember just how much people felt on the edge. So in terms of lessons, I want to start with the big obvious lesson, which is just how important it is to be careful and sensible in situations where you're uncertain about the outcome. Graham's famous, brilliant book about the Cuban Missile Crisis, Essence of Decision, the title's taken from a longer quote by President Kennedy, and I just was looking at it, and I don't want to read it to everybody. The essence of ultimate decision remains impenetrable to the observer, often indeed to the decider himself. And another quote I want to share in the subject of this first lesson is one I've heard often from General Milley, our chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's a reader, and he likes to quote something that Deng Xiaoping said, which is, "We are crossing the river stone to stone," meaning we could slip at any point. This is unstable, unsteady, be careful. So that's my starting point, and I must say that I'm pleased that the Biden administration is being pretty careful from what I can see. So a few other lessons as I look in a comparative way at these two events. Soviet missiles in Cuba were a bolt out of the blue. They were discovered by our U-2 satellites. We didn't know. There was a sense of shock. That's part of what made the crisis so intense and animated. The crisis of Ukraine has been coming at us in slow motion. I went back to Bill Burns, our CI director's memoir called Back Channel. Here's what Vladimir Putin told him in a private conversation in 2008. "Doesn't your government know that Ukraine is unstable and immature politically, and NATO is very divisive there? Don't you know that Ukraine isn't even a real country? Part of it is really East European, and part is really Russian." That was in 2008. So if you want to look at Putin's statements about nuclear weapons, they've been consistent, starting the day he invaded. On February 24, first warning, I will use nuclear weapons. February 27, he was ordering a partial mobilization of Russian deterrent forces. The day he announced the full mobilization of forces, again, repetition, we will use all weapons at our disposal. I'm not bluffing. And then finally, with annexation, we will treat an attack on our territory and respond with all weapons at our disposal. So it's very different in terms of signaling. You can argue that we're not as close to the brink, but in terms of the public statements, this is oddly, I think, beyond what we saw then, in part because there's a real war going on. I was in Kyiv a week ago. There's, this nuclear brinksmanship is taking place against the background of a real war. Brief observation about the issue of superpowers and small, tough states like Cuba and Ukraine. Don't misunderstand me. In my view, Zelensky is a hero of democratic nations and of the whole world. Fidel Castro was a communist dictator, not in any way an admirable figure. But both were charismatic leaders. Both had considerable political power. Both felt that they had a kind of blank check almost from their superpower patron. One of the things that Khrushchev did, which makes him such an interesting figure, is that as this crisis deepened, he told Castro, who was banging for action, to back down. He wrote a very sharp letter to him on October 27, after, as Nina said, there was the shoot down of these U-2 planes, basically saying, knock it off. Again, as Graham said, he wrote vividly and colorfully, but it's worth going back to look at the letter. And then Castro wrote him a kind of wounded reply. He knew he'd been backed down by his superpower patron. So at some point, Khrushchev decided that the Soviet Union's fundamental interests and those of its proxy, Cuba, were diverging. And he decided to be firm in saying, your interests and ours are not the same. And that poses, I think, a really interesting dilemma for President Biden. Will he reach a point at which he'll say to this incredibly admirable, charismatic, world-leading figure, President Zelensky, your interests and our interests are not identical? I think it's a question to think about in light of this crisis. Final point is for me the fundamental one. What does this teach us about wise decision making in an ultimate crisis involving nuclear weapons? And for me, the lesson looking at Kennedy, I can't speak really adequately to Khrushchev, is the combination of toughness, as we saw in the video. He never hedged on the question that the Soviet missiles had to be withdrawn. I mean, there was no inkling at any point of compromise. And he was authorizing the chiefs, authorizing my father to prepare to invade Cuba and go to war. So there was toughness from the beginning, but there was creativity and the ability to respond to Khrushchev. And in this sort of private chamber, really working most closely with his brother, Robert Kennedy, to find a way out. Famously, the way they did that was to decide not to answer a second belligerent letter that demanded public withdrawal of the missiles from Turkey, but to instead answer an earlier conciliatory letter. Let's answer the first letter, not the second letter. And it's always celebrated as a moment of creative genius, but the truth is that he sent Bobby in secret, his brother, to answer the second letter affirmatively. We will pull the missiles out of Turkey. Don't tell anybody. So it was, as Nina says, it was a fascinating moment of public and private, and I think that mix was the creative part. Last comment. So in response to Nina's question, is there any kind of back channel going on now? Not that I know of. I wrote a column a couple weeks ago noting that Putin had mentioned both in his mobilization order and a week earlier in a visit to Uzbekistan that Russia had been prepared to make a deal back in March. But Ukraine didn't want to do it, which is not true, but it's interesting that he said it twice. So, I wrote in the column, respond to that letter. He says he wanted to make peace. Okay, respond to that letter. So that's a first thought. The second thought is, again, drawn from this history. What ended up happening was an exchange of mutual security assurances. And if there's a way out of this crisis, I think, personally, it's going to involve a deal with a lot of finesse about withdrawal to lines of such and such a date and resolution of issues like Crimea by such and such a date. I suspect deferral of final resolution. But it will go back to the original Russian demand that got this started, which was the same darn thing that Khrushchev talked about. In the beginning, Putin said, our cities are endangered by missiles that could be fired from Ukraine. We want controls on that. As Secretary Blinken said, fine, we're happy to give you those controls. And we wrote a whole draft treaty. If we get out of this, that whole idea of guarantees for Ukraine's security, guarantees for Russia's security, I think will be the heart of it.
Good. Thank you very much. I just, as a footnote, remind you that if there were effective back-channel diplomacy going on, if there were, as in the case of the missile crisis, we wouldn't know about it. So that's uncomfortable for people in your business, but I think, as we suggest from this essential, it certainly was essential in that case. Let me take my 5 minutes to, I've got about, there's 100 wonderful lessons to draw from this, but I want to take the opportunity to hear some of the key lessons from Kennedy and other policymakers, just to remind you and stimulate your imagination. So if we take here the first one, Kennedy's first big takeaway that he learned in the missile crisis, and that he tried to teach people after in the famous American University speech, is that total war makes no sense between major nuclear powers. So let's hear what he says.
In the face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn.
Okay, so this is a great speech, the American University speech. I've probably listened to it and read it dozens of times. But a big discovery is that in a world in which both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and today the U.S. and Russia, have robust nuclear arsenals, a nuclear war makes no sense. Okay? So next, again from JFK. Therefore, what to do?
So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
So this is, again, the American University speech, Kennedy's most important foreign policy speech, in which he was trying to lay down what he took to be the key lessons from the missile crisis, again, just 5 months before he was assassinated. So one more from that same speech. Never force
and above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish.
Okay. Pretty clear and pretty relevant. Yeah? How about Bobby Kennedy? What did he say was the big takeaway?
Basically, I think the lesson is that you don't place a major power in a position where their national security, their national prestige is involved. Put them in a corner without any ability to extricate themselves. And that was begun, that was the kind of position that the Soviet Union placed the United States, started to place the United States and the free world in October of 1962. And it was the effort led by President Kennedy to ensure that in making the Soviet Union retreat, that it was not a humiliating retreat or defeat for them, but that they could throw it back from their position and still retain some prestige.
So again, underlying the proposition of not forcing a nuclear-armed adversary to choose between humiliating defeat and nuclear war. We've discussed this here in the forum more than once over the decades since. Let's hear what our colleague Ernest May, our late great colleague Ernest May, and also Bob McNamara had to say briefly.
I want to pick up for just a moment on what was just said, because it seems to me that one of the important and very difficult lessons from the crisis is that it did take time. It took time for people to work out the possibilities, to see options that they didn't see, even for President Kennedy to cool down, because he was prepared in the initial sessions to resort to an immediate attack. And that's, I say it's a difficult lesson because there is almost no chance that any president of the United States will have that leisure to deal with the crisis in future. And the importance of presidents and their advisors internalizing the lesson from this crisis that David Gergen was articulating to some students a couple of nights ago, that presidents just must not allow themselves to be hustled by the media into premature decisions. Say, I've got to think about the question.
I think the lesson is, don't decide until you're ready to decide. And people say to me, well, McNamara, surely you don't think an administration could handle it this way today with them. There'd be leaks and in 24 hours it'd be done. I will accept that. But I will not accept that therefore the president and his advisors should be forced to come to a decision that may involve the life and death of this country before they've had the time to think through the alternatives. And this is what Kennedy insisted on. He said, I want you to stay here and I want you to be here and think about this 24 hours a day until you have come to a consensus on A, what the problem is, B, what the alternative solutions are, and C, what you think we should do. And it took a week. It literally took a week of almost 24 hours a day.
Okay, I have many more comments to make on each of these, but I'm going to restrain myself given the time that we have now. I just remind you that for this combination of lessons that JFK said were his central takeaways, namely, a nuclear war is not possible, therefore can't be fought, which requires constraining ourselves and persuading our adversary to constrain himself, requires not forcing each other to choose between humiliating retreat and nuclear war. It was left to Ronald Reagan, a great communicator, to summarize this most succinctly in his favorite one-liner, which said, a nuclear war cannot be won, and then his great imperative, and must therefore never be fought. So whatever else international relations are between two powers that have robust nuclear arsenals, a nuclear war can't be won, because if at the end of it, I've completely destroyed your country, but in retaliation, my country's gone, as Reagan would say to people, you cannot put that in the victory column. So therefore, must never be fought. Well, then I have to find some way to achieve my essential objectives without a war. And then that was the beginning point for the struggle that created the imagination that David referred to. So lots to chew on there. And I think, fortunately, when you listen to President Biden say, we are not going to fight World War III over Ukraine, you can hear some echoes. So Nina, you said you had a brief comment, and then David, and then we're going to let folks in the audience line up at the microphones and short questions. Nina?
Just briefly, because it's JFK, Robert Kennedy all said that if you read, not that you would, but if you read Khrushchev's speeches during Communist Party Congresses, the 21st Party Congress, the 22nd Party Congress, half of his speeches were exactly that. Even before the Kennedys were saying this, that nuclear war could not be won. And in fact, one of this, because Khrushchev was a very flowery speaker in a sense. So he said, when the physicist told me how what the nuclear weapons can do, I couldn't sleep for weeks. But then I realized that only an idiot can start a world war, can have a nuclear war. It cannot be fought. And I slept like a baby. Because it's exactly what his message was. And to the Kennedy speech at the American University, I think August 17th, I may be wrong about the date, both Pravda and Izvestia, the two major Soviet newspapers at the time, published the speech in full. So the whole Soviet Union would read the speech, and with the understanding that not only Khrushchev says that nuclear war cannot be won, but the American president that resolved the Cuban Missile Crisis, the nuclear war cannot be won. Once again, really do not see this kind of rationale and rationality in the current Kremlin.
So absolutely. If we put up one more slide I had in my appendices, this is Khrushchev, we can just leave it up, drawing his lessons from the missile crisis. And as Nina says, they are virtually the same thing. David, you wanted to make a brief comment?
Just
and then we'll go to the group.
Very brief. As I think about this, the two X factors, if you will, in this crisis are first, Putin's propensity for taking risks. He has been pushing, as I said, since 2008. You could argue that we should have figured out a way to deal with this earlier, but he just keeps going. He went to war in 2014. He went to war, all-out invasion in February, and it just keeps amping it up. And the question of how to deal with a leader who is so determined and I think reckless is a real puzzle for the world. I mean, I have a feeling that must be defeated, but it must be defeated in a way that doesn't destroy us all. The second X factor is the Ukrainian people and their president. I just was in Kyiv just over a week ago. After they'd bombed the Kerch bridge, I left just before the spasm of attacks on Kyiv, but everybody knew they were coming. Zelensky and the Ukrainian people have done something extraordinary. They have just passed beyond the normal limits of fear, and there isn't an ounce of compromise left I can detect, in the people who've suffered as much as they have over the last 8 months. So I think those are two unusual factors at work here, and they vex all of us. Graham, I mean,
No, I think
I'm waiting for you to help me figure
no,
out.
I think you're exactly right, and as you said in your earlier comment, that basically, while we think of this as a two-party game, in the case of the missile crisis, there was actually this third party, Castro, who kept trying to get into the game, but whom Khrushchev very carefully. Kennedy, if you heard his first statement, was the punchiest line in Kennedy's announcement on October 22 that we played was, "It will be the policy of this government to regard any missile attack from Cuba as an attack by the Soviet Union. So you can't say somebody else did it. I'm holding you accountable." And then he said, quote, "to be met with a full retaliatory response." That means all out we go. So Khrushchev heard that message. That's a pretty wild thing to say. There was a lot of debate about, you're going to say that extreme? What if actually Castro should be capable of doing something by himself? You're going to let that become the trigger to Armageddon? Well, we want Khrushchev to be responsible for. Now, then you can see in the wonderful letters back and forth between Castro and Khrushchev. Yes, this is my client. Yes, this is a state, our satellite in the Western Hemisphere. But what kind of a guy have I got that I'm dealing with here? He shoots down a U-2 when we've told him not to do that. He sends me a letter saying, once I've even agreed to withdraw the missiles, that was the one that I think shocked Khrushchev in my reading the most. Castro said, well, don't bring the missiles home, just fire them against the Americans. And Khrushchev thought, this man must be out of his mind. I mean, he's not what is he doing? So I think, again, if this is any lesson for us thinking about Ukraine, there are going to be harder times as the divergence of interest between Ukraine and Europe and the U.S. emerge. So that'll be my bet. So we don't have much time left here. We'll have short questions, or we'll try to have short answers. We'll start with this gentleman. Introduce yourself and a question mark.
Hello, my name is Ben Bolger, and my question is about President Truman used 2 atomic weapons, saw the effect that it had on men, women, children, civilians, and used it a second time as well. How did America's use of atomic weapons earlier in the 20th century frame the gamesmanship, the very serious gamesmanship during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how does our track record of making a threat and following through impact current dynamics?
Great question, difficult.
Well, just briefly, it's interesting that Putin, in his most recent comment, I believe at the time of mobilization or annexation, it was one of the two, made specific reference to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what I heard him saying was, as America decided to use this ultimate weapon to force an end to a war that would have continued as a bloody, so too might we consider it as a war-ending mechanism. I found it chilling, but your point is obviously correct. The only use of nuclear weapons in history was conducted by the United States.
In thinking of the logic of the problem, it's a great way you framed it. So for most Americans now, if you said, is it conceivable that somebody rationally, purposefully conducts a nuclear strike? The answer is no. But if you say, but wait a minute, let's learn a little history. Was Truman rational and purposive? Well, yes. And is it possible to use nuclear weapons successfully to advance your policy aims in war? Well, excuse me, I think after the second bomb, the emperor surrendered. So you can see why that might ring for Putin. And I think, again, that makes it all the more complex in the current situation. But I don't think it's possible to say that a rational, purposive leader couldn't imagine that he could use nuclear weapons to advance his war aims. This gentleman.
My name's Randy Feldman. If Vladimir Putin decides to detonate nuclear weapons in this conflict, what are the chances, if any, that the Russian military will take him out of power?
Well, there's a lot of debate how Putin can stay on, because clearly this didn't go the way he planned it to go. And you saw with the mobilization, about 1.5 million people left Russia in the last month. So clearly that war that they say is being supported by the population and civil society, whatever that means in the Russian context, it's not true. So I think one of the reasons that the nuclear talk actually got toned down is because it could be that complete red line for all these other KGB clans that are around him that need him to stay because they haven't figured out how they're going to and which one is going to get up. But that could be the last one, because if tactical weapons are used, they are going to be used on, they're going to affect all the territory. And children are sanctioned, but they don't want their children to die. So if Putin wants nuclear weapons, clearly that should be all to the United States. But if it is to the United States, the end of it is horrible. So it is, I think, a big consideration. But to what David was saying is important is that Putin is a gambler. But until February 24th, he was a very careful gambler. He only bit as much as he could chew, and suddenly he just completely fell off the cliff. So it is a question of rationality, and we don't know. We simply don't know. But I think the consideration of others around him for whom that could be a red line seems to be still sort of keeping him back from that decision.
So I just make a footnote that while there's been a lot of speculation in op-eds or equivalents about the fact that or a hope that either Russian nuclear weapons don't work, or that in any case the military wouldn't execute an order. David mentioned Bill Burns, the director of CIA. I think he's America's best Putin watcher, and he's said very plainly he has no doubt about the fact that Putin could make such an order, and he expects that it would likely be executed by the troops. Now, what then would follow after that, God only knows. But I would not count on others preventing Putin doing what he might do if he decided to do it. Over here, please.
Hello, my name is Svetlana, and I'm Ukrainian student from Harvard Business School. And I want to address one of the comments made by David, who kind of hinted that, his view on the solution of this war is that, we should take Putin's demand for peace and, kind of settle down and make kind of security guarantees to both sides and so on. Well, I guess, David, if you went to Kyiv, which I'm honestly very jealous because I haven't been there for almost a year, if you've been to Kyiv, you know what Ukrainians think of that proposal very well. Sure. And my question to you is, given what we know about Russia and Putin, given how many agreements Russia has violated and keeps violating every single day, would you bet your own life on the fact that Putin will abide by the agreement, any agreement signed with Ukraine? Because me and my family are not ready for that.
I think that's the right counter, and that wouldn't be a good bet. People said to me over and over again, and I couldn't find a single person, and I probably talked to a couple dozen, who supported the idea of a negotiated settlement now. They just don't believe it. And they said a negotiated settlement would postpone the next war. We're not prepared to do that. We've suffered too much. It's just, you described the mood exactly as I encountered it. That just means there's so much suffering ahead. Maybe the Ukrainians can continue to roll their army, could just roll the Russians right out. That would be the best outcome, but so that's a long shot.
Please.
Thank you. I'm Lisa, and I'm a student at the college. My question is, for Khrushchev, most crucially, national prestige was at risk, but for Putin, it could be argued that it is centrally personal prestige. How does this impact the ability to predict Putin's decisions as a rational actor?
It's a brilliant question. I mean, it's a billion-trillion-dollar question because exactly there was Soviet system was despotic, but there was a Politburo. There were people who actually discussed. They were telling Khrushchev, "Well, you made a wrong decision. How do we get out? Let's talk about it." Putin is a singular decision maker, and therefore it's very easy to predict what he's going to do because, for me, he's a deputy KGB colonel, and he's done everything as a deputy KGB colonel, thinking that he became a generalissimo, and look at him. He's once again a deputy colonel. Anyway, so he makes these decisions, and the decisions are exactly of that kind. And basically, a lot of it, what has happened, is about power, is about him staying in power. Because if he cared about the country, he would have left, and there are plenty of people who can take care of this. In fact, Khrushchev himself was saying the younger generation, he will come and they can sign decrees much better than we do. Putin doesn't say that. He thinks he's the only one doing those decrees. That's why he needs to stay in power. And that's why I was talking about all these clans and these KGB cockroaches that are around him, and he is trying to bet on who is going to preserve not his legacy, but his existence better. And that's why this conflict is, of course, about Ukraine, but also about him staying in power. So Russia is losing while Putin cannot win. Putin cannot lose. And so this is kind of a Russian double-headed eagle conundrum, but it's very important to understand that Putin cannot lose while Russia is losing and will lose. And I think one of the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also the post-Cold War, is that when Russia loses, which it will, not Putin, he may be dead, I don't know, then don't jump on Russia's bones, because not every Russian is responsible for that. And those 1.5 million people that left show that they're not responsible for that. They don't want it. Nor that I'm asking for consideration, but probably there should be a better policy after it all ends than it was after the Cold War or post-Cuban Missile Crisis.
Great. So again, to quote Bill Burns, the director of CIA, he said very early on in the war just exactly what Nina said, quote, "This is a war Putin cannot lose and survive." So, gentlemen, we have two more. Given the time, I'm afraid we're over, but we're going to take two last questions and then we're going to wrap up. Please?
Hi, my name is Taha Bali. Years before the World War III risk was invoked over the Ukraine, it was used, and I would argue abused, to dissuade the US from curtailing the Russian intervention in Syria. So my question is whether you agree with the premise that doing more to deny Putin victory there would have stopped the crescendo of aggression that unfolded over the years since.
Okay, and we'll take this last question.
Yeah, Professor, I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about your grandfather and the misconception about politician versus dictator when it comes to Putin versus Khrushchev. I've heard the Cuban Missile Crisis story from the U.S. side maybe about 100 times, but I've never heard it from the Russian point of view. So I was wondering if you could speak about any other, as somebody who's an expert on Russia, somebody who's worked in the U.S. for a while, any other misconceptions that you see because the U.S. has X number of news sources and they don't really get to hear the Russian side. Any misconceptions that might help an American understand this crisis better from another perspective?
Okay, yikes, what a great question. So that's a good topic for a whole nother seminar.
Right.
We'll provide, and maybe we can persuade Nina to come back and do one. That'd be a terrific event in itself. But for tonight, we're going to do short versions. So Nina, why don't you do a short version to that one, and David, you to the first question, if you would be willing.
Well, I actually work on kind of American propaganda, and Russia is a center of American propaganda. So Putin became a villain in Darth Vader long before Putin was a villain in Darth Vader. Not that he ever was a good guy, but certainly he was created into anti-James Bond villain by Hollywood and the press and so on. But generally, one of the things to understand, and foreign policy American foreign policy very rarely based on this, which is unfortunate, is that America needs followers, a shining city up on the hill. Russia never follows. It has 11 time zones. So when such a giant territory, not that I think it's an advantage, but it certainly defines the Russian psyche. So Russia never follows, America needs followers. And that's a problem that has no solution.
That's very short, but very sweet. Thank you. David.
So just to respond to such a powerful question, people, I think, will be haunted for decades by what could have been done that would have prevented this awful war with the suffering, loss of life that we're still struggling to understand. What could have been done differently? And Syria is one way station on that road. I think more important to me is what preceded the 2015 Russian intervention in Syria, which was Russia's seizure of Crimea and parts of the Donbass in 2014 with effectively no American or European response. It's really stunning to think back at how little we did other than denounce it, but there was no meaningful price to pay. We did begin training the Ukrainian military. Our special forces began training them in ways that have paid big dividends from 2014 on. Without saying much about it, we helped the Ukrainians create an astonishingly good army. So, but I think we all should reflect on that. What could have been done differently so this nightmare wouldn't have happened?
So if I do just one closer, I would say, as President Biden, as I quoted earlier, said, down the path we're currently stumbling, events are likely to bring Putin to a crossroad where he'll be forced to choose between a humiliating defeat, which won't be existential for Russia, but will be existential for him, and ordering a nuclear strike on Ukraine. So if that happens, then we're going to be in an entirely new world. And the menu for possible ways of responding go from horrible to unthinkable. No good options in that. So I think the question will be whether, struggling with that reality, we now see a burst of imagination, like maybe what we saw at the end of the missile crisis. That would be the most hopeful outcome. But in any case, for a fantastic panel and for being with us, Nina and David, lots to think about. So let's say thank you very much.